There are people who camp on frozen lakes in harsh conditions for fun. Might sound crazy, but what about me? I've had fun playing Bubsy before, and even worse, I've done it on the Atari Jaguar. Typically, what most video game loving people do is start with the consoles that are more familiar to them and the games they know, then start branching out to things they're less familiar with, and from there, the sky is the limit, or maybe reality is the limit. Since the reality is, most of us will have more than enough to play without venturing into the more obscure consoles libraries. I mean, just think about how many great games there are for some of the more popular consoles. You still haven't even beaten Okami yet, have ya? Why play games for bad systems when there's still so many good games for good systems? To which some of you might say, who said anything about actually playing these consoles? There's not even a game in here. I just got this to start conversations. The thing about buying video game stuff is there's no requirement to make the most practical, pragmatic decisions. With video games, it's technically just an optional hobby, though I have my doubts. So what you need can be as simple as what you want. And if you want a Virtual Boy, yeah, there's people who own these things. That said, for 95% of people, I feel pretty safe saying that obscure consoles are probably not worth it, at least if we're talking about original hardware and not just emulating Dirty Dogs, know what I'm talking about? But 95% does still leave the 5% of people they are worth it for, and the way I've always thought of obscure consoles is this. They have a whole bunch of things going against them. High price, can be hard to find, lackluster game library, many of them are unreliable, the games are expensive, they have weird quirks, many of the good games they do have were just ported to more popular systems, all of which a person can counter with, it's kind of exotic and interesting, so I want it anyway. I mean, just looking at some collections, do they really look like they have an owner who likes to say, I'm done? I also feel like the perceived rarity aspect ties into owning these consoles, much like it does for rare video games themselves, even for the ones considered to be bad or mediocre games. A lot of people still see them as novel and cool, therefore wanting them, and same goes for obscure consoles, maybe not seen as rare in the exact same way, but nonetheless, they are something that not many people have, and owning it feels like you own an interesting piece of video game history. The Nintendo Switch, as popular as it is, and as much as I enjoy it, you tell or show somebody that you have one of these, and they say, yeah, great, my family has like 4 of those. One for me, one for my wife, one for my kid, and one for my dog. That said, with the Nintendo Switch being one of the least obscure consoles there is, I should point out that what you consider to be an obscure console matters as well, which varies depending who you are and who you're talking to. Some people consider consoles like the Sega Saturn to be obscure. Heck, some people who are far enough out of the retro gaming loop might consider any console older than 10 years to feel obscure. I think by far and away the best consoles that might be considered obscure are the Sega Saturn and PC Engine, known as TurboGrafx-16 in the US, to the point I don't really consider them obscure, mostly because they were actually fairly popular in Japan, and their obscurity has a lot to do with poor American marketing, though I would say that PC Engine / TurboGrafx-16 certainly feels more obscure of the two, because people at least know what Sega is. At least that's what my heart tells me. The main consoles I've been focusing on for this video, being the Atari Jaguar, 3DO, and Virtual Boy, weren't really popular anywhere except in the living room of that one kid you went to school with who always seemed to have everything. Also, I don't consider Neo Geo obscure because even though nobody really had the home console version, the arcade cabinets were everywhere. Now, earlier I mentioned that most of the good games for obscure consoles would typically get released on other consoles as well, usually because game devs and publishers would want to see their game actually sell well, and therefore want it on a console where it stood a chance rather than going down with the sinking ship. And because exclusives are such a heavy determining factor for buying a console, naturally, this makes it harder to justify. Just in general, there are very few amazing games that are still locked to their original hardware. However, I'd say where obscure consoles shine is with ports of games that, yeah, you can play on other consoles, but there are unique versions on the obscure consoles. How unique they need to be worth it is debatable, but what's interesting is that because these games have more well-known releases on other consoles, these specific ports tend to remain pretty exclusive. After hearing for years how great the NBA Jam port for Atari Jaguar is, it was part of what made me want a Jag, the only way to play it. Now, can fans of Rayman experience the game with one of the many other ports? Absolutely, but as a fan of the original Rayman, could I personally not resist the Jaguar version? No, I couldn't. Not that my ability to resist things is very good anyway. Of course, it's not just unique ports you can play on these consoles. There are indeed some exclusives, or games that feel most at home on that console. Games that would just feel kind of weird playing them on something different. Like, you can play Tempest 2000 on Sega Saturn, but I'll be darned if that game doesn't just feel right when played on the Jaguar. And when it comes to the Virtual Boy, yeah, there's really no way to experience any of the games without the original setup, as Nintendo themselves seems to have acknowledged with the Switch accessory. There's just no way to experience video games the way you do with Virtual Boy, or so I thought, until I cooked up a genius idea. Now all my video games feel even cooler than before, but I should warn you, it's so good you'll be tempted to start experiencing all of life this way too. Looking at the other losers walking the streets who are missing out, careful looking into the sun though, burns like the dickens. The Virtual Boy might be the ultimate I want to own a peculiar piece of gaming's history console. It's made by Nintendo, which has a devout following, and it's the weirdest console made by a company known for making weird consoles. The Virtual Boy might also be the ultimate oh darn it doesn't work console, with a ribbon cable repair being extremely common for these, to the point I've heard some describe it as it's not a matter of if it will need the repair, but when. For those who never planned on actually playing it, then I guess they may not care. And hey, one could argue that obscure consoles are way more enjoyable to stare at than regular consoles anyway. All that time spent staring at your video games instead of playing them. Just think of how much obscure consoles could enhance this. But when you're buying an expensive console, generally people would prefer that it's going to be somewhat durable. So yeah, the odds are really stacked up against some of these consoles, which in a strange way contributes to their mystique and desirability. Like, oh my goodness, a working Atari Jaguar CD unit? That's something almost nobody has, as well as something almost nobody would enjoy playing nearly as much as a dozen other more readily available consoles. Unless the novelty alone does it for you, still, I have a hard time imagining somebody owning obscure consoles before they own some of the more customary retro consoles first, unless they owned it as a kid or something. Besides that, obscure consoles are for people who are hardcore into video games and already have a lot of the other consoles looking to add a little extra spice into their collection that may or may not necessarily be the best thing to play, but at the very least is interesting because of its obscurity. So yeah, the vast majority of people will be just fine without them. You can go to bed at night tucked in with your Super Nintendo, not having to wonder what if. Except what if you actually finished Okami, you Okami backlogging dirty dogs? But Those are my thoughts. As usual, would love to hear what all of you think, either just in general or in response to some of the things I said. So with that, leave a comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the retro